Hey there, Jim Hart back at you here from the Hart Law Firm, and I've got another exciting, riveting legal episode for you today. Today we're going to be talking about contracts, and we're going to be talking specifically about the 5 different things that you really need to be thinking about as you are drafting your contracts for your business. This is kind of continuing with the theme for this month. February is we're just basically been talking about contracts this month. So yeah, I probably should get my notes here. I've got some notes on the iPad. And then who knows, maybe we'll get a little coffee in the middle. That's just kind of how we roll here. And for those of you that don't like it when I take time off to drink coffee, well, then, you can find another YouTube channel to follow, I guess, for free and get good legal advice. Well, it's not legal advice, just everything we talk about on this channel should not be construed as legal advice. I'm not your lawyer unless you hire me to be your lawyer. And the things I talk about here, educational purposes only, of course. Got to get that out of the way. Phase 1, or part 1, or the first thing that you really need to be aware of when you're dealing with contracts, and specifically we're going to be talking about today a client contract. So this is for any of you who are maybe a web designer, or maybe you do freelance writing, or you do social media services where you're helping other people with their social media accounts, or maybe Facebook ads, or anything like that. Anything where you are, or even a coach, you could be a coach. Anything where you are providing one-to-one services for people, you need to have a client contract in place. And that's just like basic legal 101, right? If you want to be protected, you need to have that client contract in place. And so the first thing I would say, before you even start the process of drafting a contract for your business or looking for a contract, you can go online, you can find free templates. I don't necessarily recommend the free templates, but there's free templates, there's paid templates. Obviously, I offer a paid template. There'll be a link down below. But before you even get to that, you need to start thinking about what is it that you're going to be providing and what is it that your clients are going to get out of your relationship. This is really, really fundamental and really, really important. What is an ideal client outcome that they're going to get from working with you? And you need to make sure you're very clear about this. And I would write it down somewhere so that you know exactly what your clients are getting when they hire you for your services. So what is it that's going to make this relationship successful for both you and for them, honestly? And then along with that, what is this relationship typically going to cost the client in terms of an investment? How much are they going to have to spend? Now, we're not talking yet about how we're going to put all that into the contract. We're just talking big picture here. What's the client typically going to spend to work with you? How are you going to charge them for that? Are you going to charge them monthly, or are you going to charge them a flat fee, or is this going to be an annual relationship? How are you going to do that? And then how long is it going to take you to deliver the services? So, maybe you're a wedding photographer and somebody's going to pay you. How much are they going to pay you up front? When are you going to ultimately provide those services? And there's multiple components for wedding photographers. There's the initial engagement where you sign a contract with the client, and then you're going to maybe do pre-wedding photography. Maybe you're going to do the setup, and then you're going to photograph the wedding. And then there's going to be all the post-production, which is where you're going to take those pictures from that wedding. You're going to pick the best ones, and you're going to make them look really, really awesome and great for the client. Maybe give them a photo album, maybe give them a CD, or do people still do CDs? Maybe they don't do CDs. I might be dating myself a little bit from my wedding. I think we got a CD, and I think an album probably is still something that people would do, because you like to be able to pull those pictures out and look at things. What types of services are you going to be providing? So all of that, you need to be thinking about that in terms of, obviously, let's go with this wedding photographer example. The ideal outcome for this client is that you're going to provide them with an amazing experience and amazing pictures that they can look at for years and years and years and remember that special day. But in terms of the deliverables, there might be other things that are involved in that relationship. So that's really the first thing that you really need to be thinking about. And that's before you even engage a client, is you need to be thinking about, number one, what are they going to get out of it? What's it going to cost them? How long is it going to take to provide the services? How much time is it going to take on your part to provide those services? Different things like that. That's really important. The second section, you're going to be starting to draft the contract. And there's a couple and really, really important parts of every contract, you need to be able to name the parties. And so who are the parties going to be in your contract? It's going to be you. It's typically going to be your business or your LLC. If you don't have an LLC yet, then it's going to be yourself as a sole proprietor. And you want to make sure it's clear in the contract who the parties are. And there's normally going to be at least two parties. There's going to be you as the service provider, and then there's going to be the client. And the client, in most cases, is going to be an individual. If you're like a wedding photographer, if you're doing B2B type work, if for those of you not in the know, that means business to business type work, then it might be another LLC that's also going to be a party to the agreement. And so it's important that you identify who those parties are in the agreement. If there's anything else, if there's anyone else that might be associated with your agreement or that might be involved, then sometimes there's what's called a third party, but that's rare. But if that's going to be the case in your situation, if whatever it is that you're doing invites a third party from time to time, then you want to make sure you identify that in your contracts as well. Part 3 is the next section that you need to add into your contracts, and that's how you are going to get paid. So in this point, we actually are going to be talking about financial compensation. And so in legal terms, this is what's called consideration. And basically, the legal definition is, I'm going to show you how cool I am from a legal perspective. It's called bona fide legal detriment, which means what legally are you giving up to enter into this contract, and what legally is your client giving up to enter into the contract. Now, typically, and there needs to be some sort of reciprocal consideration, which means you need to give something up and they need to give something up. So what you're giving up is your time to work on their project, to work on, again, going to the wedding photographer example, you're going to be giving up your time to devote to photographing their wedding, to doing all that work, to maybe hiring people to help you with the job, different things like that. What they're going to be giving up, 99.9% of the time is going to be some sort of money, or dinero, as they call it here in Portugal. And that's what they're going to be giving up. So they're going to be paying you, and you're going to be giving them your time. As you're drafting a contract, a client services agreement, you need to make sure you identify how much they're going to pay you and how frequently they're going to pay you. So you might get paid in different stages. That's very common. So you might have one flat fee. Let's say it's $5,000, but they're going to pay you, 20% up front. So they'll pay you $1,000 when you hire them. They're going to pay you an additional, let's say 60% prior to the wedding date. So that might be additional money that's going to be paid, let's say 30 days before the wedding, or you don't show up for the wedding. And then they're going to pay you the final installment, upon delivery of the services, something like that. So that's generally speaking kind of the way it could work for you. Maybe you get paid in installments based on when you do the work. So if you're designing a website for somebody, maybe they pay you an initial retainer to start the work on the website. And then after you've done the initial designs and mapped out what you're going to be doing for them, then they'll pay you another retainer to actually start coding and developing the theme for them. And then maybe they pay you a third retainer when the website goes live. So you can kind of see how this works. As another example, let's say you're a freelance writer, maybe you just get paid per article, or per word. I've seen people do that as well. So they might initially have an engagement with you to provide that work, and then after you provide your initial article, then they're going to pay you based on either the length of the words in the article or some other agreed upon measurement of what you need to be doing for them. So that's number 2, is how you're going to get paid. And then along with that, you need to make sure it's clear in the contract how you're going to get paid. So recently, most of you know I live here in Portugal, and for reasons that I've talked about previously on the channel, we were unable to sell our house back in North Carolina before we moved, and we ended up renting it out in December. And one of the things that was in that contract was how that client is going, or not client, our tenant is going to pay us our rent, because that was very important. Since I'm in Portugal and they're in the United States, how are they going to get me a rent check each month? So we had to figure out how to do that, and we put that in the rental agreement. agreement. And so you need to make sure it's very crystal clear how the client is going to pay you. So do you have a Stripe account set up where you're going to be, they're going to be going to an online checkout form and they're going to be doing it that way? Maybe PayPal, maybe Venmo. There's all sorts of different ways to get paid these days, or they're just going to give you a check. That's fine too. Maybe bank transfer or something like that, depending on the amount of money that's going to be changing hands. So do people still do checks these days? I think they do. I know I still get checks from various places, which is really annoying. Here in Europe, they don't do checks so much, but that's a whole nother issue. So anyway, that's number 3. Number 4 is a really important but often overlooked part of the contract. So you need to make sure it's crystal clear in your contract how the services might be terminated. And so this can happen in a number of different ways. Now, number 1, if you're being paid in stages and the client doesn't pay you for a certain stage, then you don't do the work for that stage. And that's pretty clear. And you want to make sure it's written into the contract that says if the client does not meet their payment obligations, then you as the service provider don't need to do any more work for them. That's very, very important to put in all the contracts that you have. You don't want to be doing work for free, and you certainly don't want to be doing work and giving it to clients for free if they have not paid you for that work yet. Oh, sorry, I forgot to check. So this is, again, my favorite mug, coffee time, I think, here in Portugal. It's getting, it's mid-morning here, and it's Valentine's Day, so my wife and I are gonna be going to a lunch. I actually didn't eat breakfast this morning because I wanted to be good and hungry for this lunch we're going. We're going to an Italian place down the road. It's really good. It's like authentic Italian. I think the owner is from Italy. Good coffee. Okay, so how can you terminate the contract? And there's a number of ways you can do that. Is it gonna be done in writing? Does it have to be in writing? Can they just tell you? Do they need to send you an email? Do they need to send you a certified letter? Hopefully you can't hear that. All of a sudden the workers downstairs have decided that this is the time they need to do lots of drilling and hammering and things. Okay, we're gonna get through this video though. How can they tell you that they wanna terminate? Or how can you tell them that you want to terminate? So you need to make sure it's clear in the contract how that's going to happen and under what the mechanism is going to be for them to let you know that they don't want to work with you anymore. When can they terminate? This is really important. So how much notice does a client need to give you, or do you need to give the client? Are you going to need to require a 30-day written notice in advance to terminate the contract? Does the contract terminate automatically once you've provided the services that you're supposed to provide under the contract? Or maybe does the contract terminate automatically upon a breach by one of the parties? So again, in the case of like payment, I would say not making a substantial payment when it's due is typically going to be considered a material breach of the contract. That's the core of the contract is that the client has to pay you money, and if they don't pay that money, then you're no longer obligated to do the work for them. So that's an important thing to put in the contract. If the contract is terminated, what are the consequences of that? Like what's going to happen? So for example, if you're doing work for a client and they gave you a bunch of information and materials and confidential things, and then they just didn't pay you, you may need to provide all that material back. You may need to give all that work product back to them. Or conversely, let's say you're doing the work. Like let's say you drafted an article for somebody and you're a freelance writer and they don't pay you for that. Are they able to still use that article for their website or their newsletter or their blog or whatever they're going to be using that for? Are they still permitted to use that? Clearly the answer here would be no, but you want to make sure you've got something written into the contract about the ownership of that intellectual property and who's going to actually own that intellectual property in the event of a breach by the client. In fact, if they don't pay you, then you still own the intellectual property. And then there could be other issues that come up here. I mean, there just could be situations where the client needs to cancel the contract for whatever reason. Anything from like COVID was a huge thing. A lot of people had to cancel contracts because of COVID, because frankly, nobody saw it coming, and all of a sudden a bunch of in-person meetings that were no longer allowed to be held had to be canceled. So there were a lot of situations where sometimes it's just out of our hands. There's a difference between this and force majeure. Now, COVID, when it first happened, was a force majeure event, but once it became known that it was widely circulating, that things were going to be closing down, it no longer was a force majeure event. There might be circumstances like, let's say somebody dies, or let's say, they get in an accident and they're in the hospital and they can no longer, perform, or they no longer need the services. Or in the event of a wedding, let's say the couple calls it off and says, we're not getting married anymore, so they no longer need you. So under what circumstances would you have to give refunds to them, or provide materials back to them? So these are all issues that you must address in your client contract. And then the last thing I would say, part 5 of this, is there's just a number of different basic clauses. I'm just going to drink some coffee while they do whatever they're doing, and we'll go through those basic clauses. So here's I have a list of about 5 or 6 different clauses that I think are really important to put into your contract. And the first one is going to be governing law. So you need to make sure it's crystal clear in your contract, especially if you're dealing with clients from out of your state, that what the governing law is for that contract. You're typically going to want it to be the law of the state where you live, because if you need to file a lawsuit, you're going to want to be able to hire a local lawyer, and you're going to want to be able to deal with that lawsuit in your jurisdiction. Along with that, you need to make sure there's a venue clause in there that says if there are any disputes to the contract, they're going to be handled in your local courts. So if you live in North Carolina, like I used to live, and you have a client that lives in Washington State, and they want to sue you, they're going to have to come to North Carolina where you are to sue you. If they sue you in Washington State, you can get it dismissed because the contract says that the lawsuit must be brought in North Carolina. So you want to make sure you have that in your contract. Another thing that's really important that I really like, so I've always been a big advocate of alternative methods of dispute resolution. In other words, if there's a dispute, instead of going to court, you find another way to get the contract resolved. And so you want to make sure you have a dispute resolution clause in your contract that says that in the event of a dispute, either you're going to submit the dispute to mediation or binding arbitration or something like that. So neither one of you has to pay the exorbitant expenses of going into court and litigating what, might not be a huge sum of money through a contract. Now, maybe it is. Now, maybe you're doing, 6-figure contracts, in which case you're going to want to have litigation clauses in there. But for most people, you're going to want to make sure you have an alternative dispute resolution clause in your contract. And then the last thing I would say, that, and this is really, really important, and this comes up more often than you can possibly imagine, is you need to have a clause in your contract regarding refunds and chargebacks. So you need to let clients know right up front, are the fees they pay you refundable? Even if they decide they don't need to go through with the contract, can they request a refund? And what happens if they issue a chargeback on your contract? That can happen. It's legally speaking, chargebacks are only supposed to happen if a customer has been defrauded. And that is rare. That really, generally speaking, doesn't happen. I can't tell you how many times I've called a credit card company because I didn't recognize a charge on my statement. And I started talking to them about it. And then they're like, oh yeah, this is from that. I remember one time specifically, there was a charge for like $100 on my credit card. Didn't recognize it, didn't have any idea who the company was. I called the credit card company to initiate a chargeback, and then they told me that it was this farm down the street from us where we bought our Christmas tree. And of course, we did not issue a chargeback. So that's the thing. Chargebacks should be reserved for when you don't recognize a charge and somebody stole your credit card and you need to deal with that. That's when that should happen. They should not be a method for clients to use to enforce their rights against a service provider because they just decided they didn't want to enter the contract. You still are in a contract, and if you're on the client side and you issue a chargeback, there can be serious ramifications against you also as the client because you're still on the hook for the contract. It doesn't matter. The chargeback is irrelevant. You're still on the hook for the contract, which means that the service provider can still come after you to enforce that contract. So just something to be aware of. So that's another thing you want to have in there. Let's see, what else? There's a number of different clauses you really need to have in your contract. what I'm going to do is, because there's just so much to unpack here with regards to how to make sure you have the right contract in place for your business, I'm going to leave a link down below to a document that you can download, and I'm going to include a bunch of information about the different types of things that you really need to have in your contract to make sure they're rock solid. And then I'm also include some bonus information in there about things that you need to review when you're going through your contracts, and some other bonus material in there. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and click the link down below to get a copy of your contract blueprint. I apologize, I would keep going, but the people downstairs are making it kind of impossible for me. If you thought this was helpful to you, make sure you click on this link right here. There's another video I did where you can learn more about the 4 contracts that you really must put in place in your business. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care, folks. Bye-bye. Another loud noise.